everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Hot Topics with the U.S. State Department. Today, we are so excited to be talking about Track 2 diplomacy, and we just really quickly want to say thank you to our sponsors that make this possible, from the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Humanities Montana, First Interstate Bank, and Clearwater Credit Union, and so many more of our Academic World Quest sponsors. These topics help us prepare for our Academic World Quest Conference, which is a 3-day global education conference that is 100% free to all students in the state of Montana. And today with us, we have Aimee Breslow. And real quick, we're going to show a quick State Department video. Can everyone see it? Can you guys see the video?
I don't see the video.
Oh, no. Well, I might not be able to show the video.
Nikki, are you sharing your screen? If you share your screen, that might be it.
That might be it. Can you all see it now?
Yes, there it is. There's.
So everyone, I just want to welcome Aimee Breslow, is the Senior Advisor in the Negotiation Support Unit in the U.S. Department of State. Aimee is a democracy and gender specialist focusing on the durability and inclusivity of peace processes. She has extensive field experience working in the Balkans, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Aimee is a jazz vocalist and a lifelong storyteller. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Aimee.
Thank you so much, Nikki. It is such a pleasure to be here. As I'll start addressing the students, as Nikki mentioned in the introduction, I'm a senior advisor with the Negotiation Support Unit, NSU for short, at the U.S. Department of State. I'm part of a team of peace process and negotiation experts who provide support to our U.S. diplomats engaged in peace processes and complex political negotiations. A peace process is a negotiation to end armed conflict, while a complex political negotiation is a negotiation to end a constitutional crisis, prevent an armed conflict, or deal with big issues like climate change. Our job isn't to lead negotiations. Rather, we're there to help our frontline diplomats, like ambassadors and special envoys, who work as a stand-in for the Secretary of State on high-level issues. We do this by conducting research and analysis or by making recommendations. In other words, we help them do their homework so they can focus on the specific country or issue at hand. We also work with people outside the government. There is a whole community of organizations that make up something we call the peace-building community of practice. This includes non-governmental organizations, universities, and grassroots organizations from all different backgrounds around the world. I mention this because many of the people in this community are women working towards peace at the international or the local level, who often don't get to sit at the peace table. The organizers have asked me to talk about women's contributions to Track 2 diplomacy. Diplomacy, by which I mean international affairs and managing our relationships with other countries, can take many forms, each serving its own distinct purpose. Scholars have classified these forms of diplomacy into different groups or tracks. The first, Track 1 diplomacy, means official negotiations and interactions between the actors who will eventually sign a peace agreement and who will have obligations to implement its terms. This could mean top-level talks between heads of state, but is more often dialogue between negotiating teams that are working for the two governments or warring parties involved in the conflict. These are often the talks that you may see on the news. Track 2 diplomacy refers to conversations about conflict resolution that take place through unofficial channels and might involve non-state actors like civil society groups, academics, and people in the private sector. Often these happen more behind the scenes. Before we talk about women in Track 2, I'd like to say a few words about inclusion. Inclusion is our biggest thematic priority. This is because, in our experience, nearly all conflict is based in some form of exclusion. So we see inclusion as an antidote to this dynamic. When I give this talk in person, I often ask the audience what behaviors make them feel excluded on a personal level. And usually we hear some combination of being intentionally ignored or not having the ability to meaningfully participate in what's going on. When this happens, people often describe feeling rejected or dishonored. I remember when I was in high school, sometimes feeling rejected or ignored when I wasn't invited to someone's party. Same feeling can arise in negotiations when certain groups aren't invited to participate. Then we ask, going back to when we usually do this class, then I ask them, what behaviors make you feel included? And they usually say, having access to information, being heard, having their opinions sought out and taken into consideration, and having the ability to meaningfully participate in decision-making. In this conversation, there's a clear feeling of being respected and honored. Therefore, when we think of inclusion in negotiations, or we think of inclusion in negotiations as creating ways for people to move from feeling rejected to feeling respected. We teach our diplomats that respect is the least expensive thing they have at their disposal to achieve their goals. It costs them nothing to treat others with respect, and it can open many doors. One sec. When we talk about inclusive peace processes, we mean processes that empower meaningful participation and decision-making from the people impacted by the conflict, and that address root causes underlying the conflict. Inclusion is necessary for durable and sustainable peace. It is vital for us because our overarching goal is to stop the cycle of violence, and to do so through words, meaning negotiations and diplomacy, rather than an all-out victory on the battlefield. The data shows us the best way to successfully do this is to take an inclusive approach. Who to include will always depend upon the conflict and the situation, but no matter where we are, we always start by asking, are women at the table? This is because the US government recognizes that women's participation in peace processes is not just a nice to have, but rather a strategic priority that advances US foreign policy. For your awareness, the US is not alone in this effort. In 2000, the international community came together to agree to United Nations Security Council resolution on women's participation in peace and security processes. This came out of a movement of civil society advocates across the world who said that women should have a seat at the table and can be active agents of positive change in their communities. 23 years later, this approach is now US law and something we work on every day. I should also mention that women's inclusion is the smart thing to do. The data tells us that women's participating before, during, and after conflict is critical to achieving lasting peace. Studies show that peace agreements are 35% more likely to last at least 15 years if women are involved. And women's meaningful participation at all levels of decision-making leads to better and more sustainable outcomes for all people. I want to be clear, this is not because women are inherently peaceful or better at building peace than men. It's because they are disproportionately affected by violence and conflict and often know best how violence has impacted everyday communities. It's also because women are often leaders within their communities and the first to notice when things are getting tense or escalating. We need their perspectives, knowledge, and unique solutions to effectively address the root causes of violence and conflict. Women and girls, the LGBTQI+ community, racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, and other underrepresented groups that have been historically disenfranchised and oppressed have unique experiences and critical perspectives that are often ignored by those in power. However, it's those often ignored voices that broaden discussions to address root causes of violence and ensure that agreements meet the needs of the community and ultimately result in more comprehensive and sustainable peace. Before we open it up to questions, I want to briefly mention resistance to inclusion. As vital and important as it is to include women and other groups in our negotiations and peace processes, not everybody wants this to happen. For different reasons, those who have power are often not willing to bring new people to the table or enter into power-sharing agreements. This is not easy stuff to deal with, but if we can take the time to analyze who's in the conflict, what their interests are, and learn from the research how different groups react and resist inclusion, it can help us prepare ahead of time to come up with strategies to mitigate its impact. I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion and your questions. I'm happy to provide some examples of women in Track 2 diplomacy, to share about how we at the State Department engage with women in civil society, and how we support gender equality and women in our own diplomacy. Lastly, just want to note that during the Q&A, I am not able to speak to our work in current conflicts. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Nikki.
Well, thank you so much. I do have a bunch of questions. My first one, it would be, how have women contributed to shaping and influencing Track 2 diplomacy initiatives? And what specific roles have they played in fostering dialogue and conflict resolution on an international stage?
Great. I've got two examples that I love. The first one, I want to share, it is an example of women engaged in Track 2 diplomacy from Colombia. And before I get into this example, I want to flag that it includes the topic of gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence. This topic can be triggering or difficult, so if you need to step away, please feel free to do so. I'll be talking about this for about 2 minutes, and then please come on back. In the Colombia example, women in civil society from all different sides of conflict, which was an over 50-year civil war, came together under a unifying goal of stopping conflict-related sexual violence, which means incidents or patterns of sexual violence that occur in conflict or post-conflict situations that can be directly or indirectly linked to conflict. This violence was perpetrated both by the Colombian government and rebel groups on women of all backgrounds. Women in Colombia fighting against conflict-related sexual violence reached out to other groups in the country who were also under threat. And together they built a powerful coalition to represent all of their voices. The coalition included women, gender and sexual minorities, indigenous communities, and other excluded groups. Over a 6-month period, women and civil society leaders addressed negotiators directly at the talks held in Havana. They gave testimony of their firsthand experiences as the victims of violence and what both sides had done to their communities. They pushed beyond an elite bargain for more inclusive measures in the peace agreement, focusing on targeted actions that would address economic disparities and the inclusion of rural populations to address the root causes of the violence. Overall, They demanded that women must be able to be a part of decisions about their own future. And they argued that peace could only be possible if the needs and experiences of Colombian women were addressed in the agreement. And I'm happy to say that their advocacy was really, really successful. And can talk more about that later, but I'm going to give another example from Liberia. So in Liberia, during the peace process in the early 2000s, this is an example of women exerting positive influence on a peace process in the early 2000s. At that time, women in Liberia launched massive campaigns to demand peace and organized consultations among the warring parties, regional actors, and the negotiators. Women helped to build legitimacy for the formal negotiations by taking place in, they helped to build legitimacy for the formal negotiations taking place by publicly calling for rebel groups and governments to stop fighting and to sit down and to talk. When things began to fall apart, women's groups successfully demanded that they come back to the table and reach an agreement. Women activists in Liberia even blocked the doors and wouldn't let the male negotiators out of the room until they came to an agreement. So just to draw from both of these two examples, the ability to reach out to other groups, the ability to really know what's happening on the ground at the local level, and the ability to bring a certain degree of legitimacy to talks that are happening sometimes outside of the country. These are really vital functions that women play, as in these examples in Colombia and Liberia and in other places around the world within Track 2 diplomacy.
Thank you so much. In the context of Track 2 diplomacy, what unique challenges do women face in comparison to their male counterparts? And how do these challenges are addressed to ensure greater inclusivity and effectiveness in diplomatic efforts?
That's a great question, Nikki. And, it's such a big question. I actually want to kind of take a step back and talk a little bit about, because it's not just one country, this is happening all over the world, and kind of talk about what it looks like in general, and then we can talk maybe a little specifics of where this shows up. But I mentioned at the end of my initial remarks about resistance to inclusion, that it is let's say, a common occurrence that those who have power don't often want to share it. And those, especially a lot of these negotiations or peace processes, they're happening in really small, like we call them circles, like these small groups of people who are coming together and making decisions for many, many, many other people. And to break into that circle can be a really, really challenging thing, even regardless of whether you're a man or woman or who are you, it's hard to break in. Add on top of that resistance to women participating, and it can be even harder. And this resistance, it shows up in a couple different ways. Actually, there's many ways, but we look at different categories. So the first kind of resistance, this can be, we call it implicit resistance, which this could be like unconscious bias. Like people might even realize they're doing it, like it's that kind of category of this is either how they grew up or this is what it's like in their particular country. They may not even realize, oh, when I do this or when I think this, it's actually pushing women out, such as we've seen both in the US and in other countries where women diplomats at negotiations, they're told, oh, go get me coffee, or, oh, you must be the secretary, you must be the administrative staff, when really they're like a lead negotiator. So like, you know what I mean? It could be unconscious, but that sort of thing is that implicit resistance that women face. The next level, kind of, we're starting with the least difficult and then going up the ladder of it becoming harder and harder. The next is what we call direct or explicit resistance. And in this category, this is like people don't want women participating and they're actively seeking ways to keep them out. And these are ways that are short of violence. So things that they can do without becoming violent. And so an example of that could be using sabotage to manipulate or hijack decision-making rules and processes, or something that's called false compliance, which is pretending to be inclusive on the surface, but behind the scenes, controlling or handpicking the participants. So like for an example, if there is a quota or a rule that says a certain amount number of the participants have to be women, in some instances, I won't name certain countries, but we've seen some situations where, as opposed to opening it up to women who are in civil society or opening it up to women who, again, are from the local communities, that people will bring their wives and they'll just sit there silently. So they look like they're being inclusive, but it's false. It really isn't. And it's a manipulating, it's not playing fair. And it's using, pretending that they're doing it, but really it's just a way to keep new people from coming inside. I'll talk about in a moment, like what you can do to address that, but I'll say the last category. And the last category is coercive resistance, which is violence. It's just straight up violence. And this could be the threat of violence. Actually, it could be violence or the threat of violence, including violence, vandalism, and even depriving people of their livelihoods, like, being threatened that you'll lose your job, you'll lose your ability to provide for your family. That's violence too. It can be psychological violence, not necessarily physical violence. So these are the things that we have seen, unfortunately, all too often, men use to try to keep women from being included in negotiations or peace processes. So what can you do about it? That's really the big question, is how can you overcome it? So with the first category, with implicit resistance, sometimes, because oftentimes that's unconscious, sometimes it's just having a conversation and saying, hey, that woman that you just asked to go get you coffee, do you realize that she's the head of the delegation? Do you realize that she actually is the representative of the president, or she is the representative of the Secretary of State? Like, oh, I didn't know that. You know what I mean? It can really change your perspective when someone speaks up and says, hey, the person that you're treating one way, you need to be aware of who they are and the role that they are playing. Sometimes training can help, just having, as opposed to a one-on-one conversation, having the ability to work with larger groups and talk about different forms of implicit bias. We find that this can be really helpful, especially if done in a non-threatening way. We're just saying, hey, perhaps you haven't thought about this, but these are different ways that implicit bias shows up. And we find that if you're sincerely working with folks who are unaware, that can be really helpful. And the next area, with the direct and explicit resistance, and this is when people, they do not want women to participate, and it's not yet violent, but they're really trying to keep them out. That, it's harder, it becomes increasingly more difficult. But here we look to something that we call process design. All right, so what does process design mean? What is that? When we're looking at a negotiation, process design is about the rules and procedures of who gets invited to the table, where people sit, who gets to speak first, who decides who's in the party, how many people are in each party. Are you going to have main conversation here, but then subsequent conversations that feed into that main conversation? These are decisions that are made in almost any negotiation where it's the process of how do we do it, regardless of what the topic of the conversation is. And so when we look to what are the ways that these rules are being manipulated, we can make decisions ahead of time to mitigate people bending those rules or not playing fair. I know our time is short, so I won't kind of dig into it, but that is the thing that we are really actively looking at. And I'll pause. I can say a lot more, but I'll pause on that. With violence, with the threat of violence, that is the hardest one to overcome. And that's really something that has to be dealt with throughout society. And that's not something that we individually can stop on our own. But if we're talking with it's a whole of government, a whole of country conversation that is working towards preventing violence or decreasing violence and its impact on women to participate.
Thank you so much, Aimee. You kind of answered actually a little bit of my next two questions. So I'm going to go off book a little, but students are learning about track 2 diplomacy in South Sudan and Afghanistan. Can you talk about maybe some examples of how track 2 diplomacy worked in those areas?
Honestly, Nikki, I would prefer not to. I would prefer not to
Okay,
go into. I'm
absolutely.
not prepared. I'm not prepared to talk about those examples, and would prefer not to go there.
No worries. Okay, so then what role do women play in promoting sustainable peace building and prevention through track two diplomacy? And how can their perspectives contribute to more comprehensive and enduring solutions to global challenges?
Well, I think I'm going to answer this in a slightly different way because I don't want to repeat some of the things that I've said.
Yes, absolutely.
Really, it's about listening to the people on the ground. When we are in shorthand, kind of in our world, when we're talking about particularly track women and track two diplomacy, it's saying, look, you have women in the health sector, women farmers, women teachers, women business women, the whole spread. Women play every single role that men do, whether it's on the local level or the community level, or up, depending on the country, depending on the situation. These women are living the conflict, or whether they're watching it develop, because it's not just about the conflict itself. Women and their perspectives can be so vital to preventing conflict from happening to begin with, and then vital to the successful implementation of a peace agreement once it is signed. These women, and I'll let's say focus primarily those who are living in local communities, the community level or the local level, they're the ones that really know what's going on in their communities. They know they don't need somebody from the outside telling them what the problem is. What they need are people to listen to them describe how they see the problem and how they see the solution. Like, that's when I really think about, like, what is track two diplomacy? It is listening to the people on the ground. When we talk about these root causes of violence, which I mentioned a couple times in the remarks, it's like things that, the conflict may be appearing to be about this up here, but really it doesn't just pop out of thin air. There are things that build, that often start. It's those root causes. And again, what the root cause is going to depend on the country. It's going to depend on the situation. But women are often the closest to understanding what is that original problem, what is at the root of the fill in the blank that needs to be addressed to either prevent violence from happening, to find a solution to resolve the conflict, or to make sure after an agreement has been signed that the changes are going to stick. I'm going to go back to the Colombia example. It's the reason it's one of my favorites. It's not just about talking to people at the negotiating table. It is designing, and this is where the women's voices were so instrumental. It was saying, as you create this agreement, they advocated and they successfully advocated for inclusion within the peace agreement to have a consultative mechanism, which is a fancy way of saying you have to keep talking to us. Once this agreement is signed, doesn't mean that you never talk to us again. We want to have regularly scheduled meetings where we can give you feedback and we can say, okay, you said, like in the agreement, it said that you would do 1, 2, and 3. Well, we're going to tell you how we see things working, and we're going to give you our feedback. Are you actually doing what you said you would do? And if you are doing it, we're going to tell you what that result looks like within the community or the village or the town. That sort of feedback is so important to making sure that violence doesn't happen again, because all too often, peace agreements, let's say more times than not, they don't last forever, because unless you're looking at, like, what is that original problem and making sure that you're staying on top of it and you're getting feedback from the local community, if that original problem, that root cause problem, isn't dealt with, it can come back and erupt in violence later on. Women are uniquely situated to be able to see it, speak to it, and be really clear about what they think the solutions are.
Well, thank you so much, Aimee. And I think we're going to close it there. Well, thank you so much for coming on and joining us for day 2 of Hot Topics with the U.S. State Department in preparation for our Academic World Quest Conference for high school students across the state of Montana. And thank you again to our sponsors, Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Clearwater Credit Union, First Interstate Bank, and Humanities Montana, and all of our other Academic World Quest sponsors. Thank you so much. And Aimee, thank you again. And Irina for helping us form this day 2 of topics with the U.S. State Department. Have a wonderful day.